I turned 70 believing I understood my place in my son's life. I thought distance was just maturity, that missed calls were harmless, and that sacrifice was still remembered even when it went unspoken. Then, on my birthday, I learned how easy it was for my existence to be rescheduled, managed, and quietly replaced. The lie itself was small, almost polite. What it revealed was not. In that moment, I realized something far more painful than being forgotten. I had been considered inconvenient. And once you see that truth clearly, pretending it does not exist is no longer an option. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how these stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community truly special, and we're grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with emotion, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, get comfortable, maybe grab your favorite drink, and let's begin. My name is Eleanor Price, and I am 72 years old. I live alone in a modest apartment overlooking Elliott Bay in Seattle, Washington, a city that never truly goes quiet. Even in the early morning, ferries cut across the gray water, cargo ships drift in the distance, and the hum of traffic blends with the cry of gulls. I have watched this view for years, long enough to measure time by the changing light on the bay rather than by dates on a calendar. I was married for 43 years to Mark Price, a man who believed that stability was the highest form of love. He was an engineer, careful with numbers, and serious about planning ahead. Mark believed you showed love by preparing for the future before anyone asked you to. Long before illness entered our lives, he had organized insurance policies, savings, investments, and documents neatly labeled in folders that still sit on my shelf. He died 9 years ago after a quiet, stubborn battle with cancer, and the silence he left behind never really faded. It only settled in different corners of the apartment. After Mark passed, I learned to live alone without making a spectacle of it. I brew my own coffee each morning. I call the plumber myself when the sink leaks. I carry groceries up the stairs, one careful step at a time. People often mistake independence for loneliness, but the truth is more complicated. I was not helpless. I was simply no longer consulted. Before retirement, I spent most of my life as a high school English teacher. I taught students how to read between the lines, how to recognize motivation, how to understand that what people say is rarely the whole story. Ironically, I never imagined I would need those same skills to understand my own family. For decades, I believed that honesty, once taught, stayed with a person. I did not consider how success, pressure, and pride could slowly rewrite a person's values. My son, Daniel Price, is the center of that change. He is now the chief financial officer of a technology company in Bellevue, Washington, surrounded by glass-walled offices and people in constant motion. He speaks the language of projections, growth, and risk management with ease. When he was younger, he called every Sunday. Now our conversations are brief and efficient, often ending with him promising to call back later. I've always told myself that his distance was a sign of ambition, not neglect. Daniel's wife, Melissa, lives in a world carefully arranged for cameras and followers. She presents a polished version of family life online, one where meals are beautifully staged and smiles appear on cue. In person, she is polite but distant, as if I exist slightly outside the frame she wants to maintain. Her mother, Carol Thompson, notices everything with a calculating eye. A successful real estate agent, Carol views homes, neighborhoods, and people through the same lens, assessing value, return, and potential. There is one person who does not see me that way. Lily, my granddaughter, is 15 and quietly observant. She sits beside me on the couch, shows me how to use my phone properly, and listens when I talk without interrupting. With Lily, I am not an obligation or a background detail. I am simply her grandmother. As I stood by the window that morning, watching the bay carry on without me, I told myself that families evolve and expectations change. I believed I understood my place in that evolution. I believed that patience and trust were still enough. What I did not realize then was that this quiet confidence marked the very beginning of a reckoning I was not prepared for, one that would force me to read my own story far more carefully than I ever had before. If you're still watching and this beginning feels unsettlingly familiar, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Because what came next was not just disappointing, it changed everything I thought I knew. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. I woke earlier than usual that morning, not because of noise or restlessness, but because my mind had already named the day before my body had fully stirred. I was 72 years old. The number settled quietly in my chest, neither heavy nor frightening, just present. At this age, birthdays no longer feel like milestones you climb toward. They feel more like markers you pass, reminders that time moves forward whether anyone is watching or not. The apartment was still dim, Seattle wrapped in its usual gray calm. I brewed my coffee and stood by the window, looking down at Elliott Bay as ferries began their steady crossings. There were no cards on the counter, no flowers by the sink, no alert on my phone lighting up the screen. I was not waiting for a celebration. Still, somewhere inside me, there lingered a simple hope for acknowledgement. One dinner, one unrushed conversation, nothing extravagant, just time. 72 made me reflective in a way younger birthdays never did. I thought of the years when Mark was still alive, when he insisted on taking me out even if money was tight, when Daniel would set the table crookedly and beam as if the smallest effort were a grand gift. I remembered being surrounded by noise and stories, by warmth that did not need planning. Those memories did not make me sad. What unsettled me was how distant they now felt, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. I decided I would not wait all day wondering whether my son would call. That felt too close to surrender. Instead, I picked up the phone and called Daniel myself. I told myself I was being practical and mature, not needy. I rehearsed nothing. I simply wanted to invite him to dinner, the way one adult invites another. He answered quickly, his voice already edged with distraction. I reminded him, gently, that it was my birthday. There was a pause, followed by a cheerful but rushed acknowledgement. I suggested dinner near Lake Union. Nothing formal, just a place where we could sit and talk. The lake had always meant something to us. It felt neutral and familiar. Daniel declined. He explained that he had to travel to San Francisco that evening for a last-minute meeting with investors. His words came smoothly, efficiently, as if this explanation had been used before. He said he would make it up to me over the weekend, promised we would do something then. The call ended quickly, politely, without space for silence. I sat still for a long moment after the screen went dark. I did not feel anger. What settled over me instead was a quiet disappointment, the kind you recognize too well to argue with. I told myself again that he was busy, that this was the shape of adulthood now. I reminded myself that his career demanded things I never had to juggle. Still, an older, deeper thought rose uninvited. It was not that he could not come. It was that he chose not to. The apartment felt unusually still. The clock ticked. The coffee had gone untouched. I noticed how easily I could have let the day pass as if it were any other, how familiar that retreat felt. For a fleeting moment, I considered canceling everything, staying home, letting the evening fade into the same quiet routine I had mastered over the years. Then I realized how much that quiet had already taken from me. I walked to the bedroom and opened the closet. I chose clothes I rarely wore now, something simple but deliberate. Around my neck, I placed the scarf Mark had given me years ago, one I saved for days that felt important even when no one else seemed to notice. My reflection looked older, yes, but steady, capable. I made a reservation at a small restaurant by Lake Union. One person, a table by the window. As I closed the door of my apartment behind me, I believed what I had been saying all along. I believed my son was on a flight to San Francisco. I believed this birthday would pass quietly but intact. I did not yet know that I was walking toward a truth that would change how I saw my family and myself forever. If you're still here and you can sense something isn't adding up, comment number 2 below. That quiet doubt turned into evidence I could no longer ignore. Let's continue to chapter 3. The restaurant by Lake Union greeted me with soft light and a low murmur of conversation, the kind of place that felt suspended between water and city. Outside the tall windows, the lake shimmered under strings of lights from the docks, boats rocking gently as if nothing in the world required urgency. I reminded myself that choosing to come here alone was not an act of defeat. It was dignity. I had shown up for my own life. The young man who greeted me at the door studied my face for a moment before smiling in recognition. He told me he had been in my English class years ago, back when he struggled with essays and metaphors. He wished me a happy birthday with a warmth that felt unpracticed and sincere. That single sentence, offered without obligation, settled deeper than he could have known. Strangers, it seemed, still had time for me. As he led me toward my table, we passed a row of seats close to the window. I glanced without meaning to, my attention caught by movement and familiar posture. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, that I was projecting shapes onto shadows. But recognition has its own gravity. I slowed my steps. Daniel sat there, angled toward the lake, his jacket draped neatly over the chair. He did not look like a man rushing between airports. His phone rested idly on the table, untouched. Across from him sat Melissa, elegant and composed, her expression rehearsed into ease. Beside her was Carol, her presence unmistakable, leaning in with the authority of someone who expected agreement, not discussion. Something inside me went still. There was no sharp shock, no rush of tears, just the quiet, unmistakable settling of truth. San Francisco existed somewhere else entirely. My son was here. I asked the server for a table in the corner, my voice calm and steady. From that angle, I could see them clearly without drawing attention to myself. I ordered water and stared out at the lake until my breathing returned to a normal rhythm. It would have been easier to leave, but I stayed. Leaving felt like retreat, and I had already retreated enough in my life. A small cake appeared on their table, simple but deliberate. The candles formed the number 45. The meaning settled in slowly, then all at once. Melissa's birthday. I remembered years when we celebrated together, gathering on a single weekend, so no one felt overlooked. This year, the separation was intentional. I watched Daniel smile as Melissa leaned toward him, watched Carol gesture as she spoke, clearly directing the moment. There was no malice in their faces, no sign of wrongdoing. That was what hurt most. The lie had been easy for him because he no longer saw it as significant. Then I heard Carol's voice, lowered but confident, drifting across the space between us. She spoke of a retirement facility in Bellevue, one she called upscale, with views and services that would suit someone my age. She mentioned selling my apartment as if it were a simple transaction, a practical solution. Daniel offered no resistance. He nodded once, said something about explaining it to me later, about signatures and convenience. The words settled heavily. This was not about my birthday, This was about my place being reassigned without my consent. I looked back at the lake, at the reflection trembling in the water, and felt something unfamiliar taking shape beneath the hurt. Clarity. For the first time, I understood that silence had not protected me. It had invited decisions to be made in my absence. When my food arrived, I barely tasted it. Across the room, laughter rose and fell, candles were blown out. A moment was archived in photographs. I did not interrupt. I did not confront. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer a passive observer in my own life. I sat there alone, steady and unseen, knowing that this quiet betrayal was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. If you're still watching and that moment made your stomach drop, comment number 3, so I know you felt it too. What I discovered next forced me to choose between staying silent or reclaiming control. Let's move on to chapter 4. I left the restaurant without looking back, my footsteps steady as I crossed the sidewalk toward the quiet edge of the lake. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of water and pine from somewhere beyond the docks. Lake Union reflected the city lights with a calm indifference that felt almost cruel. Everything looked exactly as it had when I arrived, yet something inside me had shifted beyond repair. On the drive home, my mind replayed the evening in fragments. Daniel's relaxed posture at the table, the neat candles forming the number 45, Carol's confident voice discussing my future as if it were a problem already solved. It was not the lie alone that unsettled me. It was how easily my absence had been accepted, how efficiently my life had been rearranged without me in the room. I resisted the urge to call Daniel when I got home. Emotion has a way of begging for release, but I knew a confrontation fueled by hurt would only confirm the role they already imagined for me. Instead, I sat in the darkened living room and let the silence settle. I reminded myself that clarity required patience. If I spoke too soon, I would miss the truth beneath the explanations. The next morning, I brewed coffee and followed my routine carefully, as if structure might anchor me. When I finally called Daniel, I kept my voice light and ordinary. I asked about his work, about his travel schedule. He answered easily, offering updates that sounded practiced and smooth. There was no hesitation, no hint that the night before had troubled him. I then asked a careful question, framed as concern rather than accusation. I wondered aloud what he thought would happen if I ever needed help managing daily things, stairs or errands or appointments. Daniel responded immediately, as if the answer had long been prepared. He spoke of upscale retirement communities, of selling my apartment to make life simpler, of professional care arranged neatly through financial planning. He assured me he would handle everything. As he spoke, I felt myself shrinking in his language. His words were not unkind, but they were absolute. Each sentence quietly removed a choice I had not offered to give away. When he said I would not need to worry about understanding the details, that he would manage the complicated parts, I recognized the shift. Concern had become control, dressed in reassurance. After the call ended, I did not cry. Instead, a thin, focused resolve settled in. I thought of Mark and the care he had taken to put my name on every important document. He had trusted our son, but he trusted me more. That memory guided my next step. I contacted Harold, the financial advisor who had worked with our family for decades. His office smelled faintly of old leather and paper, comfortingly unchanged. As he reviewed our accounts, he began pointing out documents I had forgotten, then paused at one I did not recognize at all. It was a limited power of attorney authorizing certain financial decisions. My signature was there, familiar yet oddly wrong. I could not remember signing it. The notarization listed a Bellevue office I had never visited. Harold explained calmly what that document allowed, how it could be used, and what it meant if left unchallenged. Each explanation tightened something in my chest. This was no misunderstanding. This was not a son acting too protectively. It was a structure already in motion. When I left his office, the city felt sharper, more alert. I was no longer reacting to a lie. I was responding to a threat to my autonomy. I did not feel fear so much as certainty. Silence had been my habit, but it would no longer serve me. As I walked toward my car, I understood that the version of myself who believed patience would preserve love was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew that to protect her life, she would have to step fully into it. The next call I made would change everything. If you're still with me after that realization, comment number 4 below. Because what I uncovered next wasn't just emotional, it was legal, and it changed the direction of everything. Let's move ahead from here. By the time I called Rachel Kim, I was no longer searching for reassurance. I needed clarity, and I needed it grounded in the kind of precision that emotion could not provide. Rachel had once sat in the front row of my classroom, sharp-eyed and relentless in debate. Decades later, she was a respected attorney in Seattle, specializing in elder law, a field I had never imagined would intersect with my own life. Her office was spare and orderly, free of dramatic decor or sentimental clutter. It felt intentional, a place where facts were allowed to speak without interference. I told her everything, beginning with my birthday and moving carefully, chronologically, through the dinner at Lake Union, Carol's casual assumptions, Daniel's silence, and finally the document Harold had shown me. Rachel listened without interrupting, her expression steady, her pen still. When I handed her the copy of the limited power of attorney, she studied it closely. She did not rush to alarm me, but she did not minimize what she saw either. She explained calmly that situations like mine were more common than people realize. Documents could be signed under pressure, misrepresented in their intent, or completed without proper explanation. In some cases, signatures were guided or outright forged. The important thing, she said, was not to speculate, but to act. She outlined the immediate steps with careful precision. The first priority was to protect what was mine while the facts were verified. She drafted notices to my banks and financial institutions, instructing them to temporarily suspend any authority granted through the questionable document. Until the matter was resolved, no major transactions would occur without my direct involvement. As she spoke, something unfamiliar settled over me. Relief. Not because the situation was resolved, but because it was finally contained. We moved next to my long-neglected estate planning. Rachel recommended a living trust, one that clearly stated I retain full control of my assets while alive. It was not about punishment or distribution. It was about autonomy. I would decide where I lived, how my money was used, and who participated in those decisions. Nothing would be automatic. Nothing would be assumed. At one point, Rachel asked a question she did not soften. She explained that if evidence of deliberate misconduct emerged, I would have the option to pursue legal action. The word lawsuit hovered briefly between us. I considered it carefully. I thought of Daniel as a boy at the kitchen table, of his nervous pride on graduation day, of his voice the night Mark died. I shook my head. Not now. My boundaries could be firm without becoming destructive. I wanted accountability, not annihilation. Rachel nodded, understanding without judgment. She reminded me that choosing restraint did not mean surrender. It meant I was deciding the terms. Before I left, we prepared for the conversation I knew was coming. She advised me on what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. Facts would matter. Emotion would be enough on its own. I would not accuse. I would state. If others reacted poorly, that would tell me everything I needed to know. On my way home, my phone buzzed. A message from Melissa appeared on the screen, inviting me to a family brunch at their house that weekend. The timing felt deliberate, though I could not yet tell by whom. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, reading the words again. In the past, I might have hesitated, questioned whether I belonged. This time, I accepted. That evening, I placed the newly printed documents beside Mark's old folders and closed the cabinet with a steady hand. I did not feel victorious. I felt awake. The betrayal had not broken me. It had clarified what was at stake. For years, I had believed patience would be enough to preserve connection. Now I understood something deeper. Love without boundaries was an invitation to be erased. Whatever came next, I would no longer step into a room unprepared. The house in Bellevue looked exactly like it did in Melissa's videos. Expansive, spotless, and carefully arranged so that every corner appeared intentional. High ceilings, pale wood floors, sunlight filtered through wide windows. It was beautiful in a way that felt impersonal, more like a showroom than a home. As I stepped inside, I had the distinct sense of entering a space designed to impress, not to comfort. Brunch had already been set out on the long kitchen island. Plates were arranged with symmetry, glasses polished until they caught the light just right. Melissa moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, smiling as if nothing were amiss. Daniel hovered near the far counter, glancing at his phone more than at me. Lily sat quietly at the table, her attention flicking between the adults, absorbing tensions no one named aloud. Carol arrived last, her presence immediately shifting the room's balance, confident and commanding. Conversation started easily enough, light remarks about weather and schedules, but it did not take long for Carol to steer it where she wanted. She spoke of comfort and planning, of how aging should be handled proactively rather than emotionally. Her tone suggested expertise, as if my life were another property listing she had reviewed. She described a retirement community near Bellevue with views and amenities, presenting it as an elegant solution rather than a personal upheaval. Her words landed with rehearsed certainty. Daniel joined in, seamlessly translating concern into strategy. He talked about finances, about efficiency, about reducing complexity. He said I should not have to worry about decisions, that everything would be easier if handled professionally. Listening to him, I realized he was no longer speaking to me as a son would to a mother. He sounded like an executive presenting a plan, confident that the numbers would justify the outcome. I let them speak. Every assumption, every carefully worded phrase confirmed what I already knew. Interrupting would only fracture the moment before it reached its truth. Instead, I watched their faces, noted the way decisions had already been made in their minds. By the time the room fell briefly quiet, my resolve felt steady, almost calm. I reached into my bag and set the documents on the table, the sound of paper against stone cutting cleanly through the atmosphere. I explained that I had reorganized my assets into a living trust. I stated that all prior authorizations had been revoked. The words were simple, factual, delivered without accusation. The effect, however, was immediate. Daniel's expression faltered, the confidence draining from his posture. Melissa froze, caught somewhere between confusion and dawning awareness. Carol reacted with visible irritation, as though a deal had fallen through. I continued, outlining what I had decided. A substantial portion of my estate would be dedicated to Lily's education, placed beyond anyone's casual reach. Another portion would establish a scholarship in Mark's name, honoring values that had defined our life together. The rest remained mine to manage as I saw fit. I made it clear that these choices were not punishment. They were protection. No one spoke for a long moment. Lily looked at me with a mixture of surprise and something like pride. Daniel seemed smaller somehow, stripped of assumptions he had worn comfortably. Carol attempted to reassert control, questioning my judgment, my timing. I did not engage. I simply held my ground. I told them I would not pursue legal action, though I could. That decision was deliberate. However, I also made my boundary unmistakable. Trust would have to be earned again through consistency and respect, not entitlement or convenience. When I stood to leave, there was no dramatic exit. I thanked Melissa for the meal I had barely touched. I kissed Lily's cheek. As I walked back toward my car, the house behind me remained immaculate and silent. I felt no triumph, only certainty. The rules had changed, not because I wanted control over others, but because I finally reclaimed it for myself. If you're still watching and that confrontation left you holding your breath, comment number 6 to let me know you're here. The fallout didn't stop there. It only began to spread. Let's move on to chapter 7. The days following the brunch unfolded quietly on the surface, yet beneath that calm ran a current of unease I could feel even during my morning walks by Elliott Bay. I returned to my routines with intention, heating leftovers, watering the plants Mark once tended, watching fairies drift in and out like punctuation marks in a sentence that refused to end. Nothing dramatic happened at first. That was what made it unsettling. Life went on as if no boundary had been redrawn. Daniel called less often. When he did, his voice carried a restraint I had never heard before, a carefulness that suggested he was measuring each word. The confidence that once shaped our conversations had softened, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. I did not ask questions. I listened, and I noted the change. It was the sound of someone learning that not every door opened automatically anymore. It was Lily who broke the quiet. She came by one afternoon after school, backpack slung low, her usual quick steps slowed by hesitation. We sat at the small table by the window, the bay muted behind us. She told me, haltingly, that she had recorded a short video the night of my birthday at the restaurant by Lake Union. Not intentionally, not to expose anyone, but because her phone had been in her hand when she noticed the tension. The clip was brief. It showed me mentioning San Francisco and her father faltering in response. Lily admitted that she had shared the video in a private online group where teenagers talked about their relationships with grandparents. She said she was angry and confused, trying to understand why I looked so calm while being ignored. She did not expect it to go anywhere, but it did. The video moved beyond the group, shared by people who recognized the dynamic even without names or context. It touched something raw and familiar. Eleanor did not appear on screen as a character with a backstory. She appeared as a mother being dismissed, and that was enough. When Lily realized what had happened, fear replaced anger. She was afraid she had caused damage she could not repair. I did not scold her. What unsettled me was not the sharing itself, but how quickly a private truth could become public once it left our hands. For a moment, I felt the same lack of control that had haunted me earlier, only now it wore a different shape. The consequences reached Daniel faster than I expected. In finance, reputation is as valuable as numbers. Whispers began at his office, quiet questions about judgment and ethics. No one accused him outright, but concern has its own weight. The legal department began reviewing internal policies related to conflicts of interest, and Daniel found himself navigating scrutiny he had never anticipated. Melissa reacted differently. Her carefully built image felt fragile, exposed to a narrative she could not curate. Panic replaced polish, and I heard through Lily that she was fixing online settings late into the night, trying to contain something that was no longer hers to manage. When Lily apologized, her voice small and unsure, I told her the truth. She had acted out of loyalty, not cruelty. The lesson was not that she had done wrong, but that truth, once released, does not ask permission before it moves. Alone again, I considered the strange turn my life had taken. For years, my silence had protected appearances. Breaking it had consequences, both intended and accidental. Yet, as unsettling as it was to see the story escape the confines of family, I understood something clearly. The damage had not come from exposure, it had come from denial. The ripples were not finished spreading. I could feel that much, but for the first time in a long while, I was not bracing myself for impact. I was preparing, deliberately, to choose what came next. After the noise of the past weeks faded, a strange stillness settled over my days. It was not the heavy silence I had known before, the kind filled with waiting and swallowing words. This quiet felt earned, like the pause after a long storm, when the air clears, but the ground is still damp. I moved through my apartment slowly, noticing details I had ignored for years, the way the afternoon light rested on the bookshelf, the slight creak in the floor near the window Mark loved to stand by. For the first time, nothing felt urgent, yet nothing felt uncertain either. I found myself replaying the chain of events, not with regret, but with clarity. The birthday dinner that exposed the lie, the brunch where I reclaimed control, the video that slipped beyond our family and forced truths into daylight. None of it stood alone. Each moment had built on years of quiet accommodation, of choosing peace at the cost of my own voice. Seeing it laid out so plainly was sobering, but also stabilizing. Once you understand the pattern, it can no longer surprise you. Rather than retreat into defensiveness, I chose to move forward deliberately. I reviewed my living trust again, refining it so that it reflected not just legal protection, but intention. I adjusted timelines, clarified terms, and included provisions for donations that reflected values Mark and I had always shared. It was not about controlling outcomes. It was about ensuring that whatever happened next would not happen by default. At the same time, I signed up for a memoir writing class at the community center. The idea surprised even me. I was not interested in airing grievances or seeking sympathy. What drew me was the chance to put my experiences into language shaped by my own hand. Writing, I realized, was another form of agency. Each page allowed me to choose what mattered, what endured, and what could finally be set down. Lily came by one evening, quieter than usual. We talked openly, without blame, about what had happened with the video. I told her that truth carries responsibility, and that intention matters as much as outcome. She listened carefully, absorbing the difference between protecting someone and exposing them. I could see the lesson settling gently, not as fear, but as understanding. A few days later, Daniel reached out. The message was brief, without requests or explanations. He asked if we could meet whenever I felt ready. I noticed the absence of urgency, the lack of expectation. It was the first time he had approached me without trying to manage the result. I did not respond right away. I allowed myself the space to consider what readiness meant for me. In the midst of these changes, I made a small but meaningful decision. I sold one of Mark's old watches, a piece we had never worn but kept out of sentiment. Letting it go did not feel like loss. It felt like acknowledgement. Memory does not live in objects alone. It lives in how we choose to move forward carrying what mattered most. As the days passed, I felt no pull to justify myself to anyone. The tension that once lived permanently in my chest had softened. I was not healed in the neat way stories often promise, but I was grounded. I understood now that reconciliation, if it came, would come on terms that honored who I had become, not who others preferred me to be. For the first time, I was not reacting to what had been done to me. I was choosing the direction ahead, fully aware that whatever waited in the final chapter would meet a woman who stood firmly in her own life. If you're still with me and wondering whether healing or heartbreak comes next, comment number 8 below. Because what follows is not the ending people expect, but it is the ending that mattered most. Let's move toward the conclusion. I agreed to meet Daniel on a quiet afternoon near Elliott Bay, choosing a small cafe where neither of us had the advantage of familiarity. The gray sky felt appropriate, muted and honest, without the false brightness of optimism. I wanted clarity, not comfort. Daniel arrived early. From the window, I saw him sitting alone, shoulders slightly rounded, his coffee untouched. He looked smaller than I remembered, not diminished, but stripped of certainty. When I sat down, there was no forced smile, no practiced confidence, just weariness and something close to humility. He began speaking almost immediately. He did not deny the lie or attempt to explain it away. He admitted that he had avoided honesty because it was easier than dealing with disappointment. He acknowledged letting Carol's opinions shape decisions that were not hers to make. Most importantly, he admitted that he had treated my life as something to organize rather than something to respect. I listened quietly, resisting the old instinct to soften the moment for him. Silence, I had learned, could be an act of strength. This was not a conversation that required saving. It required truth. When it was my turn, I told him calmly that I had no intention of cutting him out of my life. But I was equally clear that I would not return to the version of our relationship where my autonomy was optional. I explained that my boundaries were not punishment. They were protection. I did not need to be managed, planned for, or spoken about in my absence. What I required was simple, honesty. I did not need to be consulted on every choice, only those that affected my own existence. Respect, I told him, does not mean agreement. It means inclusion. Daniel accepted this without argument. We sat quietly for a while, watching the water through the cafe window. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no promise that everything would return to what it once was. That version of us no longer existed. When I stood to leave, I felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing remained unspoken. I walked away knowing that whatever relationship came next would be built on reality, not illusion. These days, my mornings begin quietly. I wake early, as I always have, grind fresh coffee, and stand by the window looking out toward Elliott Bay. The water shifts color with the light, sometimes silver, sometimes gray, never the same 2 days in a row. There is comfort in that constancy of change. Life continues, even after moments that feel like endings. I often think back to the morning of my 70th birthday, to that simple phone call and the lie that followed. It was a small thing on its own, almost forgettable. Yet it opened a door I had kept closed for years. One lie was all it took to reveal how far my life had drifted from my own hands. It was not about the dinner. It was about what the dinner represented. Growing older as a woman means learning how easily you can become invisible. Decisions are made around you, not with you. Your needs are translated into inconveniences. Your independence is mistaken for fragility. I had accepted that quietly, believing patience was a form of love. What I learned is that patience without boundaries can erase you. I do not blame myself for the silence that shaped those years. I did what many women of my generation were taught to do. We kept things together. We smoothed rough edges. We made space for everyone else. Understanding that context allowed me to change without bitterness. Awareness, not anger, brought me back to myself. There is a difference between love and control, though they often wear the same clothes. Love respects choice. Control makes decisions and calls them care. I had to learn to hear the difference, even when it came from people I cherished most. Speaking up did not require shouting or drama. It required timing and clarity. Once I said what I needed to say, calmly and without apology, everything shifted. Not because others suddenly understood me, but because I finally understood myself. If there is a message I carry forward, it is this. It is never too late to reclaim your voice, not at 50, not at 70. Age does not diminish your right to decide the shape of your life. Experience sharpens it. This story was never about revenge. There was no pleasure in forcing anyone to face discomfort. It was about growth. Mine, certainly, but also my son's. We are still learning how to meet each other honestly, without roles that no longer fit. Peace, I have discovered, does not come from being forgiven or validated. It comes from self-respect, from knowing that your life belongs to you and acting accordingly. At 70, I did not reach the end of my story. I reached the moment it became fully mine. Some stories do not end with triumph or loss, but with understanding. They remind us that life is not a straight line, and that growth often arrives disguised as discomfort. There are moments when silence feels like strength, until we realize it has slowly taught others to speak for us. And then there comes a choice: to remain quietly preserved or to step forward and claim what was never meant to be surrendered. This story is not about blame or revenge. It is about boundaries, dignity, and the quiet courage it takes to redefine oneself later in life. It is a reminder that respect does not fade with age, and that self-worth is not something we inherit from others, but something we choose again and again. Thank you for spending this time here, for listening with an open heart. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments and consider following and subscribing for more meaningful stories like this. Your voice matters too.